On an ordinary Saturday morning, Sarah and Tom were excited to escape their busy lives for a day at the beach. They had been planning this trip for months, just the two of them, away from work, away from their usual stresses. It was their annual tradition, a time to reconnect with each other and soak in the sun. Sarah, in her late 20s, was full of energy, constantly bustling with ideas and plans, always looking for something new to explore. Tom, on the other hand, was more laid back. He was in his early 30s, a man who preferred the calm and simple things in life. Their relationship was built on balance, Sarah's excitement for life and Tom's steady, grounded nature. Together, they made a perfect pair. It had been a long week. Tom had spent countless hours at his job as a project manager, managing endless emails and conference calls. Sarah had been swamped with her own workload, a mixture of client meetings and creative brainstorming sessions. They both needed this break, something to recharge their batteries and remind them of the beauty of the world beyond their daily routines. So, with a picnic basket in hand, they set out for the beach, a short drive from their home. The drive was peaceful, and the scenery was breathtaking. The sun was shining brightly, the sky a perfect shade of blue, and the sound of the ocean waves calling to them in the distance. Sarah, with her usual excitement, was already talking about what they would do once they arrived, whether they'd swim, take long walks on the shore, or simply lay on the beach and read. Tom, ever the calming presence, smiled and agreed, letting her chatter fill the car. It had been a while since they had time to talk about anything other than work, and he appreciated the way Sarah's enthusiasm brought so much life to their quiet moments together. As they parked near the beach, the salty air filled their lungs, and the sound of seagulls in the distance added to the relaxing ambience. Sarah jumped out of the car, eager to get to the sand, while Tom took his time gathering their things. It was one of those perfect days where the sun wasn't too hot and the breeze was just right. They walked hand in hand down to the shore, their feet sinking into the soft sand with each step. Sarah let out a content sigh, feeling the stress of the week melt away as she felt the warmth of the sun on her skin. "Let's walk along the water," she suggested, looking up at Tom with a smile. "I want to see how far we can go." Tom laughed softly, nodding. "As long as you don't expect me to run," he teased. "I promise I won't make you run," she replied, her eyes sparkling. They had been together long enough for Tom to know that when Sarah set her mind to something, she wouldn't back down easily. But she also knew when to slow down for his sake. They started walking along the shoreline, the water lapping at their feet with every wave. It was early enough that the beach wasn't crowded, just a few other couples and families scattered along the sand. Sarah was in her element, talking about everything from their plans for the upcoming months to random observations about the beach. Tom was content to listen, his gaze fixed on the horizon as they strolled together. For the first half hour, everything felt perfect. But then, Sarah began to feel something strange. At first, it was just a light sensation, a tingling feeling that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't painful, but it was enough to make her pause for a moment. She shook it off, thinking it was just the coolness of the ocean water or the sand between her toes. But as they continued walking, the feeling intensified. Her feet started to feel heavier, almost as if they were covered in a layer of sand that wasn't there. She wriggled her toes, trying to shake off the sensation, but it persisted. "Tom," she said, her voice a bit uncertain. "Do you feel that?" He turned to look at her. "Feel what?" "My feet." "They feel weird," Sarah replied, trying to describe the odd sensation. "Like there's something under my skin, but I can't see anything." Tom furrowed his brow, looking down at her feet. Maybe it's just the sand. It can get stuck between your toes sometimes." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though she didn't feel convinced. The tingling was turning into a slight ache, and her skin began to feel strangely tight, as though it were being pulled in different directions. She didn't want to worry Tom, so she decided to keep walking. But as they continued, the discomfort grew. After a few more minutes, Sarah stopped in her tracks. "I think I need to sit down," she said, a bit out of breath from the growing discomfort in her feet. "This is getting weird." Tom nodded, concerned. They walked over to a nearby beach blanket and sat down, Sarah carefully taking off her sandals. As she placed her feet on the towel, she looked down and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Her feet were reddened, the skin inflamed and slightly swollen. Small, puffy blisters had begun to form on the soles, and her toes were turning an unusual shade of pink. Tom's eyes widened as he took in the sight. "Sarah, that doesn't look normal," he said, his voice laced with concern. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "It just started feeling weird, and now this. I don't know what's going on." Tom stood up, his mind racing. "We should get back to the car and head to the doctor, just to be safe." Sarah nodded, though she felt embarrassed. It was just a walk on the beach, and now here she was with swollen feet and a strange condition. How had things escalated so quickly? But Tom was right, they needed to figure out what was going on. They made their way back to the car, Sarah limping slightly, trying to keep the pain manageable. Tom drove them home, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Sarah kept her feet propped up on the dashboard, trying to ease the discomfort. As they neared home, she glanced at her feet again, but now, the swelling seemed even worse. The redness had spread up her ankles, and the blisters were multiplying. "I think we need to go to the doctor tonight," Tom said, his voice firm. "This isn't just from walking in the sand. Something's wrong." "I know," Sarah whispered, feeling a wave of panic rise in her chest. "I'm scared, Tom. What if it's something serious?" Tom reached over and took her hand, trying to reassure her. "We'll get through this, Sarah. Let's just get checked out. We'll figure it out." That night, as Sarah lay in bed with her feet elevated, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She had always been active and healthy, someone who loved to take walks on the beach, hike through the woods, and run on the treadmill. This strange reaction was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. What could have caused it? And why was it happening now? Her mind raced with thoughts of what the doctor might say. Was it some kind of allergic reaction? Or perhaps a weird environmental factor? But deep down, she had a sinking feeling that it was something more serious. Something that couldn't be fixed with a simple cream or a few days of rest. As she closed her eyes, the ache in her feet seemed to grow, as though the very skin of her feet was being stretched too tight. Her body was reacting in ways she couldn't understand, and the more she thought about it, the more terrified she became. What was happening to her? And was she going to be okay? The answers seemed so far out of reach, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. She just wanted to feel normal again. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find her feet in even worse condition. The swelling had spread to her calves, and the redness had intensified overnight, turning her skin an angry shade of crimson. The blisters were larger now, some of them threatening to burst at any moment. She gasped when she saw the state of her feet. What had started as a strange discomfort was now a terrifying sight. She felt a sharp pang of panic shoot through her chest, and her first instinct was to call the doctor. "Tom," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to go to the hospital. This is getting worse." Tom, who had been pacing the room, stopped in his tracks when he saw her feet. His face paled as he looked at her swollen legs, and the concern in his eyes deepened. "We're going to the ER, Sarah. Right now," he said, his voice resolute. Sarah nodded, feeling a wave of fear wash over her. She had never experienced anything like this before. In the past, a small injury or a mild illness would have passed with little thought. But now, with her feet looking so distorted and painful, everything seemed so much more serious. She could barely stand, let alone walk, and she felt utterly helpless. Tom rushed to get the car ready while Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced with questions. What had caused this sudden, extreme reaction? Could it be something she had stepped in on the beach? An allergic reaction? Or was it something far worse, something that would change her life forever? The drive to the hospital was silent, except for Sarah's shallow breaths and the sound of the car engine humming steadily. Tom drove quickly but carefully, his eyes fixed on the road while his hand occasionally glanced toward Sarah, who was staring at her feet, unable to look away. She could feel the pain radiating from her toes up to her knees, a constant reminder that this wasn't something simple. When they arrived at the emergency room, the situation only seemed to worsen. The waiting room was crowded with people, but Sarah's condition had escalated to the point where she couldn't wait. Tom immediately spoke to the nurse at the front desk, explaining what had happened and urging her to help as quickly as possible. The nurse glanced at Sarah's feet and quickly led them to an examination room without any further questions. It was clear that something wasn't right, and the urgency of the situation was evident in their reactions. A few minutes later, a doctor entered, his brow furrowed with concern. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and quickly began assessing Sarah's condition. His fingers gently probed the swollen skin, and he frowned as he felt the heat radiating from her feet. "What happened?" he asked. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah struggled to explain, her voice strained. "It started yesterday when we were walking on the beach. I thought it was just sand in my shoes, but then it started to feel strange. And now, this." Dr. Patel nodded, still carefully examining her feet. "It seems like an allergic reaction, but this level of swelling and the blisters, this isn't typical. I'm going to run some tests, but I need to know if you've had any previous allergic reactions to anything, or if you've been exposed to any new substances recently." Sarah shook her head, confusion and fear flooding her. "I don't have allergies. I mean, I've never had anything like this before. And I've been to the beach hundreds of times. Nothing like this has ever happened." The doctor gave a small, tight-lipped smile, trying to reassure her. It could be an environmental factor. The beach has a lot of different elements that could cause a reaction. Saltwater, sand, certain plants. We'll need to do some tests to narrow it down. He ordered blood work and a few other tests to check for any possible infections or toxins in her system. While they waited for the results, Dr. Patel instructed Sarah to rest her feet and keep them elevated as much as possible. He prescribed a painkiller to help with the swelling, though Sarah was too nervous to even think about taking it. Tom rushed to get the car ready while Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced with questions. What had caused this sudden, extreme reaction? Could it be something she had stepped in on the beach? An allergic reaction? Or was it something far worse, something that would change her life forever? The drive to the hospital was silent, except for Sarah's shallow breaths and the sound of the car engine humming steadily. Tom drove quickly but carefully, his eyes fixed on the road while his hand occasionally glanced toward Sarah, who was staring at her feet, unable to look away. She could feel the pain radiating from her toes up to her knees, a constant reminder that this wasn't something simple. When they arrived at the emergency room, the situation only seemed to worsen. The waiting room was crowded with people, but Sarah's condition had escalated to the point where she couldn't wait. Tom immediately spoke to the nurse at the front desk, explaining what had happened and urging her to help as quickly as possible. The nurse glanced at Sarah's feet and quickly led them to an examination room without any further questions. It was clear that something wasn't right, and the urgency of the situation was evident in their reactions. A few minutes later, a doctor entered, his brow furrowed with concern. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and quickly began assessing Sarah's condition. His fingers gently probed the swollen skin, and he frowned as he felt the heat radiating from her feet. "What happened?" he asked. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah struggled to explain, her voice strained. It started yesterday when we were walking on the beach. I thought it was just sand in my shoes, but then it started to feel strange. And now, this. Dr. Patel nodded, still carefully examining her feet. It seems like an allergic reaction, but this level of swelling and the blisters, this isn't typical. I'm going to run some tests, but I need to know if you've had any previous allergic reactions to anything, or if you've been exposed to any new substances recently. Sarah shook her head, confusion and fear flooding her. I don't have allergies. I mean, I've never had anything like this before. And I've been to the beach hundreds of times. Nothing like this has ever happened. The doctor gave a small, tight-lipped smile, trying to reassure her. It could be an environmental factor. The beach has a lot of different elements that could cause a reaction. Saltwater, sand, certain plants. We'll need to do some tests to narrow it down. He ordered blood work and a few other tests to check for any possible infections or toxins in her system. While they waited for the results, Dr. Patel instructed Sarah to rest her feet and keep them elevated as much as possible. He prescribed a painkiller to help with the swelling, though Sarah was too nervous to even think about taking it. But despite Tom's words, Sarah couldn't shake the gnawing fear that had settled deep within her. This wasn't just an allergic reaction, this wasn't something that could be fixed with a quick visit to the doctor and a few pills. This was something serious, something that had come out of nowhere and turned their perfect day at the beach into a nightmare. As the doctor left to arrange her treatment, Sarah tried to focus on her breathing, but it was hard. Her mind was in overdrive, racing with thoughts of what could happen next. What if the infection didn't respond to the antibiotics? What if it spread further? And most terrifying of all, what if this was just the beginning of something far worse? She wanted answers, but more than anything, she wanted the pain to stop. She wanted to wake up from this nightmare and return to the life she had before. But it seemed that the world she once knew was slipping away, piece by piece. The uncertainty of her condition, the fear of the unknown, it was all too much to bear. The weight of it settled on her chest, suffocating her as she tried to make sense of everything. And just as she was beginning to lose hope, something unexpected happened. A nurse came in with a new set of instructions, and as she explained the next steps in Sarah's treatment, the weight of the situation seemed to shift, just slightly. There was a glimmer of hope in her voice, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. As the days passed, Sarah's condition worsened. The swelling in her legs and feet didn't subside, despite the constant medication and rounds of antibiotics. It was a relentless cycle of pain, fear, and uncertainty. Every time Sarah looked down at her feet, it was as though a nightmare was unfolding right before her eyes. The redness, the blistering, and the tightness only seemed to escalate. What was once just a bothersome irritation after a walk on the beach was now a life-threatening infection that no one seemed to fully understand. Tom stayed by her side, rarely leaving her in the hospital. He had become her constant, the one person she clung to for comfort and support. He watched helplessly as the doctors ran more tests, taking blood samples and cultures from her feet, trying to figure out what was causing the infection. They had all but ruled out an allergic reaction to any known substance. Nothing seemed to make sense. Each new test came back inconclusive, adding to the growing mystery. It was late one night when Sarah's fever spiked again, reaching a level that caused alarm in the nurses monitoring her. She was delirious, her body burning with fever as she tossed and turned in her hospital bed. Her mind drifted in and out of consciousness, images of the beach dancing in her head, the sand between her toes, the peaceful waves crashing gently against the shore. But the memories no longer felt peaceful. They felt like a trap, an inescapable nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Tom, sitting by her side, noticed how pale and weak she had become. He had never seen her like this, her once vibrant energy replaced by a fragile, fevered version of herself. He held her hand tightly, whispering words of comfort, though he feared they were falling on deaf ears. "Sarah, please," he whispered, his voice strained. "You have to fight this. We're in this together. You're not alone." But as the night wore on, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this was worse than they had been told. The doctors had been cautious in their warnings, never truly explaining how grave the situation had become. He couldn't help but wonder if they were hiding something, if the infection was more dangerous than they realized. The next morning, Sarah's condition took a turn for the worse. Her fever was higher than ever, and the pain in her feet had become unbearable. The blisters had multiplied, and the area around them had turned a deep, dark purple. Her breathing was shallow, and her body seemed to be shutting down. The doctors were becoming more concerned, and they immediately called for a specialist. Dr. Patel, who had been overseeing Sarah's case, arrived in her room with a grim expression on his face. He looked at the monitors and then turned to Tom and Sarah, his eyes filled with concern. "We've consulted with an infectious disease specialist," he said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We need to move quickly. We've ruled out many possibilities, but the bacteria we suspect is unlike anything we've seen before. It's resistant to the treatments we've been using, and we have to change our approach." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The words, resistant, and bacteria, only made her fear grow stronger. What did that mean for her? What kind of bacteria was so powerful that the doctors couldn't even treat it? "What are you saying, Dr. Patel?" Tom asked, his voice tight with worry. "We need to get her into a more specialized treatment program," Dr. Patel continued. "There's a hospital in the next city over that deals with more complex infections like this. I want to transfer Sarah there immediately, but it's going to take some time. We can't afford to wait." Tom looked down at Sarah, his heart heavy. He could see the fear in her eyes, the silent plea for reassurance. He kissed her forehead and nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes. Just, please, help her." The doctors moved quickly, arranging for Sarah's transfer to the specialized hospital. It felt like a blur as they wheeled her out of the room, the sound of the gurney wheels echoing through the sterile hallways. Tom stayed close, never leaving her side as they navigated through the maze of hospital corridors, the fear in his heart growing with every step. He wasn't sure what to expect from this new hospital, but he knew it was their only hope. Upon arriving at the specialized facility, Sarah was immediately rushed into a state-of-the-art isolation room. The new doctors and nurses worked with impressive precision, examining her condition, running fresh tests, and adding more intravenous lines to administer stronger antibiotics. Sarah could barely stay awake, her body too weak to fight the infection that was ravaging it. Her legs felt like they were on fire, and every time she moved, the pain seemed to intensify. She could hear the muffled voices of the doctors outside her room, discussing her case in hushed tones, but it was as though the world had become distant. Nothing seemed real anymore. Days passed in a blur. Sarah remained unconscious for most of the time, her body hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically around her. Tom spent every moment he could at her side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, even though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He didn't care. He couldn't leave her, not when she needed him the most. One morning, after a particularly long night of watching over Sarah, Tom stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The hospital was located in a quiet part of town, surrounded by tall trees and small houses. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had been gnawing at him since this whole ordeal began. He felt like he was losing Sarah piece by piece, and no matter how much he tried to help, it didn't seem like he could do anything to stop it. He sat down on a bench near the hospital entrance, his head in his hands. His mind raced with worry. What if they couldn't find a cure? What if the infection spread too far? What if he lost her? He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. And then, just as he was about to give in to the overwhelming flood of emotions, he heard a voice. A soft, familiar voice calling his name. Tom?" He looked up to see a man standing before him, a tall figure dressed in a white coat. His eyes were kind, but there was an intensity to his expression that made Tom sit up straighter. "I'm Dr. Hartley," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm one of the specialists working on Sarah's case. Can we talk?" Tom nodded, his chest tightening at the mention of Sarah's name. He had been waiting for any kind of breakthrough, any glimmer of hope, but the more he saw of the doctors, the more he realized how serious the situation was. He stood up and followed Dr. Hartley into a private room. "I know this has been difficult for both of you," Dr. Hartley began, once they were seated. "But I wanted to speak with you personally because we've made a significant breakthrough. We've found a rare strain of bacteria that is responsible for Sarah's condition. It's been resistant to the treatments we've tried so far, but we've identified the exact antibiotic that should work." Tom felt a surge of hope wash over him, but he remained cautious. "So, there's a chance?" "There's more than just a chance," Dr. Hartley said, his tone firm. "We're starting Sarah on the new antibiotic today. It's not a guarantee, but it's the best option we have. We'll monitor her closely and make adjustments if necessary, but I'm optimistic that this treatment will make a difference." Tom's eyes filled with tears as relief flooded through him. He wanted to believe in the doctor's words, to hold on to the hope that Sarah would make it through this. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of light in the dark tunnel of uncertainty. I don't know how to thank you," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Hartley smiled softly. "It's not over yet, Tom. But we're fighting, and that's what matters. You've got to stay strong for Sarah. She needs you." Tom nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. He wasn't going to give up on Sarah, not now, not ever. He would fight with everything he had. And with that, he returned to Sarah's side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The road to recovery was uncertain, but for the first time in days, he believed that they might just make it through. Days blurred into nights as Tom remained at Sarah's side, steadfast and unwavering in his determination to help her overcome the infection that had taken over her body. The treatment, though promising, came with its own set of challenges. Sarah's body was reacting to the new antibiotics, and while there were signs of improvement, there were also moments of distress that worried Tom even more than he had anticipated. The first few days after Sarah was started on the new antibiotic were a roller coaster. Tom noticed a slight decrease in her fever, a positive sign, but it was quickly followed by waves of nausea and dizziness that seemed to consume her. Her once vibrant face appeared sunken, her skin pale, and her eyes lost the spark of life that had always been there. The pain in her feet didn't subside either. Every time she tried to move or shift in bed, she winced in agony. The blisters, though smaller, still remained, covering much of her feet and ankles, as if mocking every attempt at recovery. Despite all this, Sarah's doctors remained optimistic. Dr. Hartley checked in daily, offering words of encouragement and adjusting the treatment as needed. The constant presence of medical staff, all working tirelessly to keep her stable, gave Tom some sense of relief, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The thought of losing Sarah was a constant weight on his chest, one he carried with him wherever he went. One evening, after the doctors had completed their rounds, Tom sat in the small chair beside Sarah's bed, watching her as she slept fitfully. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with an almost painful slowness. He reached out and gently took her hand, running his thumb over her cold skin in a soothing motion. As he did, he thought back to the moment they had first met, years ago, when life was simple and carefree. They had been walking through a park, just two strangers passing each other by, when their eyes met and something in that brief exchange felt like destiny. It had been love at first sight for him, and he knew, even back then, that she was the one. Now, here they were, facing an uncertain future, battling an invisible enemy, with nothing but hope to guide them through. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, letting his thoughts wander. He thought about the early days of their relationship, the trips they had taken, the small joys they had shared. The way Sarah laughed when she was happy, how her eyes sparkled when she told stories of her childhood, how she held his hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Those memories kept him grounded in the storm of uncertainty surrounding them now. He needed to believe that the woman he loved would be strong enough to fight this, just as she had fought through so many obstacles in the past. As the days passed, Sarah's condition remained precarious. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic, but Tom could see the cracks in their demeanor, the way their faces betrayed a growing concern. The antibiotics weren't working as quickly as they had hoped, and Sarah's body was struggling to keep up. Her feet, though slightly better in appearance, were still swollen and painful. The blisters, now scabbed over, left behind scars that would likely be permanent reminders of the ordeal they had been through. But it wasn't just the physical toll that worried Tom. It was the emotional toll. Sarah was beginning to withdraw, her spirit broken by the endless cycle of pain and frustration. She barely spoke anymore, and when she did, it was only in whispers. Tom could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of not knowing if she would ever walk again without pain, if she would ever be the same again. One night, as Sarah lay in a restless sleep, Tom took a walk through the hospital. He needed some fresh air, some space to clear his mind. He had become so consumed by Sarah's illness that he hadn't had a moment to think about his own feelings. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts racing, trying to figure out how he could help her. He had been so focused on being strong for her that he hadn't allowed himself to grieve, to process the fear that had taken root in his own heart. As he walked, he found himself outside in the hospital courtyard. The air was cool, a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees surrounding the area. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to be still. He thought about how much he had taken Sarah for granted before all of this. He had never truly understood the depth of her strength, the way she faced life's challenges head-on with grace and determination. But now, as he stood there in the silence, he realized just how much he had relied on her, how much he needed her. And it terrified him. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, but eventually, he felt a presence behind him. Turning around, he was surprised to find Dr. Patel standing there, his face a mixture of concern and resolve. "I thought I might find you here," Dr. Patel said quietly, his voice soothing. "You look like you could use a break." Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His throat felt tight, as if the weight of the past few weeks had finally caught up to him. He had been so focused on Sarah, so consumed by her battle, that he had neglected his own emotional well-being. Dr. Patel didn't push him to talk, but instead stood beside him, looking out at the dark sky. They stood in silence for a few moments before Dr. Patel spoke again. "You know, I've been a doctor for a long time," he began, his voice calm but firm. "And I've seen a lot of patients come and go. But there's something different about Sarah. She's strong, Tom. She's a fighter. And I believe she's going to make it through this." Tom's eyes filled with tears at the words. He had needed to hear them, needed to believe in something again. He turned to Dr. Patel, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you really think she's going to make it?" Dr. Patel nodded. "I do. But she needs you, Tom. She needs your strength, your belief in her. You have to keep fighting with her, even when it feels like it's too much." Tom swallowed hard, the emotion threatening to overtake him. He nodded, his heart heavy with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaky. "I needed to hear that." Dr. Patel gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm here if you ever need to talk. But remember, we're all in this together." With that, Dr. Patel left Tom alone in the courtyard, but something inside Tom had shifted. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't promise that everything would be okay. But he knew one thing for sure, he would never give up on Sarah. He would fight for her, just as she had fought for him and for their life together. No matter what the outcome, he would be by her side, holding her hand through it all. The next few days brought more challenges, but with each new hurdle, Tom's resolve grew stronger. He watched Sarah closely, noticing small signs of improvement, like the way her breathing had become less labored or the slight decrease in the swelling in her feet. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Tom, that was enough to hold on to. Each small victory, each glimmer of hope, was a step closer to bringing Sarah back from the brink. And then, one morning, something miraculous happened. Sarah opened her eyes for the first time in days, her gaze clearing as she looked up at Tom. Her lips trembled as she spoke softly, her voice hoarse but filled with the strength that Tom had always known was inside her. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Tom's heart swelled with emotion as he leaned over her, his hand gently cupping her face. "Sarah, don't apologize. You don't have to say anything. Just focus on getting better." Tears welled in his eyes as he watched her, his heart swelling with a love that had only deepened over the course of this ordeal. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. They were going to make it through this. Together. And as Sarah's grip on his hand tightened, Tom knew that the battle wasn't over yet, but it had only just begun. Their fight for a future together was far from finished, but this moment, this small sign of life, was all they needed to take the next step forward. Days turned into weeks, and though Sarah's recovery wasn't without its struggles, the small victories continued to stack up. Each morning, Tom would sit beside her, quietly observing the gentle progress she was making, hoping for more signs of improvement. The pain in her feet, though still present, had lessened. The blisters, which had once consumed her skin, had begun to scab over and fade, leaving only scars as reminders of the battle she had fought. Every day brought a new challenge, but with each challenge, Sarah's resolve became more evident. Tom could see it in her eyes, the fire that had once burned brightly in her was starting to return, though it was still faint. She wasn't the same woman she had been before the infection, but there was a strength in her now that Tom admired even more than before. For weeks, she had been confined to a hospital bed, her every movement slow and deliberate, as if the mere act of lifting her foot required an immense amount of effort. But as she began to regain strength, her doctors began to allow her small moments of independence. At first, they had to help her sit up and move her legs, but soon she was able to do it on her own. And then, one fateful morning, after nearly a month of relentless determination and treatment, she took her first step. It was a hesitant step at first, her foot barely lifting off the floor as she wobbled on the edge of uncertainty. Tom was there beside her, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched her, his face a mixture of hope and fear. "You've got this," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "One step at a time." Sarah's eyes met his, filled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled, truly smiled, not out of obligation or fatigue, but from a place deep within her heart. With a deep breath, she shifted her weight and took another step, this time with more confidence. It was shaky, but it was a step nonetheless. "I did it," she said, her voice shaky but filled with pride. She leaned heavily on the walker her doctors had given her, but she was standing. Standing on her own 2 feet, after everything she had been through. Tom felt a lump form in his throat as he reached out and took her hand. "You sure did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're amazing, Sarah." The small room seemed to glow with an almost tangible sense of relief and joy, as if the walls themselves were exhaling the breath they had been holding for so long. Sarah's recovery had been a long and grueling journey, but this moment was a testament to her strength. It wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about resilience, about never giving up, no matter how dark things seemed. For the next few days, Sarah continued to take small steps, building her strength with each movement. Her body, though weakened from the infection, was starting to remember what it was like to walk. It wasn't graceful, and it certainly wasn't easy, but she was moving forward. And that was enough for both of them. But as Sarah slowly began to regain her mobility, Tom couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still off. Her recovery, while remarkable, had come at a cost. The emotional toll this entire ordeal had taken on both of them was still fresh. Tom had been so focused on Sarah's physical health, on making sure she could walk again, that he hadn't fully processed the emotional weight of the situation. He hadn't realized how deeply this experience had affected both of them, how much they had both changed in such a short amount of time. One evening, as Sarah sat in a chair beside the window, her feet resting on a soft pillow, Tom noticed something in her eyes, something that had been missing before. There was a distance there now, a quiet sadness that he hadn't seen in her before. It was subtle, but it was there. She had been through something life-changing, something that not only affected her body but also her mind. The trauma, though not visible in the way her feet had been, was still there, lingering beneath the surface. He sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "Sarah, I've been thinking. I know you've made so much progress, but I also know this hasn't been easy on you. I don't want to just focus on your recovery. I want to know how you're feeling. Really feeling." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She squeezed his hand instead, as if asking for more time, more space to process everything that had happened. "I know you're strong," Tom continued softly. "But I also know you've been through something that most people couldn't even imagine. And I just want to make sure you're okay. That we're okay." Sarah took a deep breath and turned to face him, her gaze steady, though her eyes were still tinged with sadness. "I don't think I'll ever be the same again, Tom," she said quietly. "And that scares me." Tom's heart clenched at her words, the weight of her vulnerability hitting him like a ton of bricks. "You don't have to be the same, Sarah," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You just have to be you. And that's all I need." For a moment, they sat in silence, the soft ticking of the clock filling the space between them. It wasn't awkward silence, but rather the quiet acceptance of a new reality, a reality where the person they were before the infection might never fully return, but where the person they had become together was still enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The days passed slowly, and Sarah's recovery continued at a steady pace. She was walking with the aid of a cane now, her confidence growing with each step. But even though she was physically improving, Tom knew that there was still more work to be done. Sarah wasn't the only one who needed healing. He had been so focused on her that he had neglected his own emotional journey. He, too, had to come to terms with the fact that their lives had changed forever. It wasn't just Sarah who needed to find her way back, it was both of them. One evening, as they sat together in the living room of their apartment, finally back home after weeks in the hospital, Tom realized how far they had come. They had faced something unimaginable, something that had torn them both apart in ways they hadn't expected. But they were still here. They were still together. And that, he realized, was the most important thing. "You know," Tom said, his voice thoughtful, "when we were in that hospital, I kept thinking about how much I needed you. But now, I think I understand something more important. I need us. We need each other, not just to get through the hard times, but to keep moving forward, together." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't agree more," she whispered. "We're stronger now, Tom. Together." And in that moment, Tom realized something profound. They had been through something horrific, something that had tested them in ways they never thought possible. But in the end, it wasn't just about Sarah's recovery. It was about their relationship, their bond, and the way they had faced adversity as a team. They were stronger, not just because Sarah had fought for her life, but because they had fought together, side by side. There would be more challenges ahead. There would be days when they would both feel the weight of the past pressing down on them. But Tom knew one thing for certain: whatever came their way, they would face it together. And that, more than anything, was enough. As the months passed, Sarah's recovery continued, but not in the way Tom had anticipated. They had both expected a straight path forward, with setbacks and struggles, but at least a sense of certainty that they were headed in the right direction. However, life doesn't always work that way. There were good days, where Sarah seemed stronger than ever, and days when she could barely get out of bed, overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened to her. The unpredictability was a constant challenge, not only for Sarah but for both of them. Yet, with every passing day, they learned more about each other and about themselves. It was on one particularly challenging day that Tom noticed a change in Sarah. She had been quiet for hours, her gaze distant as she stared out the window, lost in thought. Her physical recovery had come so far, yet Tom could see a storm brewing beneath the surface. It was as if the mental and emotional toll of everything she had endured was catching up to her, and she had no way of fully processing it all. He tried to engage her in conversation, but Sarah was hesitant to talk, her words coming out in fragmented sentences, as if she was unsure how to express the depth of what she was feeling. She'd become increasingly withdrawn, unsure of how to handle the mix of emotions that still consumed her. Tom knew that recovery wasn't just about the body, it was about healing the heart and mind as well. But neither of them had known how to tackle the emotional aftermath. It wasn't until one evening, after dinner, when Sarah finally opened up. They were sitting together on the couch, watching a movie that neither of them was really paying attention to. Tom glanced at her, noticing how pale her face had become, how her eyes seemed lost in some distant thought. He had asked if she was feeling okay, and it was then that she finally spoke. "I don't know what to do anymore, Tom," she said, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "I feel like I'm stuck between the person I used to be and this new version of me, and I don't know how to reconcile the two. It's like I'm constantly at war with myself." Tom turned to her, his heart aching as he saw the pain in her eyes. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said gently, reaching for her hand. "I'm here with you. We're in this together. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you need, I'll be here." She shook her head, her face contorting with frustration. "But I don't even know what I need. I've spent so much time focusing on getting better physically that I haven't taken the time to think about what this has done to me, to us. How do I move forward when I feel like a stranger in my own body?" Tom held her hand tightly, trying to offer comfort, but the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. They were both stuck in the aftershocks of the trauma they had endured together, and while they had made incredible progress, it was clear they still had a long way to go. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Tom found himself awake, his mind racing with thoughts. He had always believed that with time, everything would fall into place. But now, it seemed that they both needed more than just time. They needed healing on a deeper level, a level that required more than just physical recovery. They needed to learn how to live with the scars, how to acknowledge the emotional toll of what they had gone through without letting it consume them. The next day, Tom made a decision. He had been putting it off for too long, but he knew that this was something they couldn't face alone anymore. He made an appointment with a counselor, a professional who could help both of them work through the emotional trauma they had experienced. He didn't know how Sarah would react, but he was ready to do whatever it took to help her, and himself, find peace. When he told Sarah about the appointment, she was hesitant at first. She didn't want to admit that she needed help, that this was something bigger than both of them. But after some quiet, honest conversation, Sarah agreed. She knew that something needed to change, that they needed to take a different approach if they were going to heal properly. The first counseling session was difficult. There were moments of silence, moments where neither of them knew what to say. But as they continued attending sessions together, they began to open up more. The counselor was patient, guiding them through the layers of pain and uncertainty, allowing them to explore their emotions and fears in a safe space. It wasn't easy, and there were days when they felt like they were taking steps backward, but the progress was undeniable. Slowly, but surely, they began to rebuild their emotional connection, learning to navigate the complexities of their feelings without letting them tear them apart. But even with the counseling sessions helping, there was still a lingering sense of unease. As Sarah began to regain her strength, both physically and emotionally, Tom noticed that she was pulling away from certain aspects of their life. She had become withdrawn in social situations, avoiding interactions with friends and family. She was grateful for their support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong in the same spaces anymore. It was as though the trauma had created a distance between her and everything she once knew. She didn't feel like the same person, and she didn't know how to bridge the gap between who she had been and who she was now. One evening, Tom came home from work to find Sarah standing at the window, gazing out at the city below. She didn't seem to notice him enter the room. Her face was contemplative, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed at peace. Tom approached her slowly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, but knowing that he couldn't let it go on much longer without reaching out. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, standing next to her. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes warm but still haunted by the past. "I'm thinking about who I am now. And who I want to be. I think I've spent so much time trying to get back to who I was, but maybe that's not the goal anymore. Maybe it's time to start thinking about who I want to become." Tom smiled gently, his heart swelling with pride for the woman in front of him. "You're already becoming her, Sarah. Every single day. You're stronger than you realize." The moment hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. They both knew that this journey was far from over. There would still be days when Sarah's recovery felt like an uphill battle. There would still be moments of doubt, moments where the weight of the past would threaten to pull them under. But Tom knew that they had something they hadn't had before, the understanding that healing wasn't a destination, but a process. It wasn't about getting back to who they had been, it was about learning to live with what had happened and finding a new path forward, together. As the weeks went on, Sarah found herself more and more willing to face the challenges that came with her recovery. She took up new hobbies, started volunteering at a local charity, and slowly, she found the courage to reconnect with old friends. Her fear and sadness didn't disappear overnight, but she began to see a future where she could still be happy, even in the aftermath of the trauma. The community, too, had changed. The event that had rocked their lives had also brought people together in ways they hadn't expected. Neighbors and friends who had once kept to themselves now offered support, checking in on them, offering help when needed. There was a sense of unity, of collective healing, that had emerged from the darkest of times. Tom and Sarah realized that while they couldn't control what had happened, they could choose how they responded to it. They could choose to move forward, with courage and hope, knowing that they had each other, and the community, by their side. In the end, Sarah's journey was not one of simply surviving, but of thriving in the face of adversity. She had learned to embrace the changes, to accept the parts of herself that had been scarred by the experience, and to understand that true strength came not from returning to who she had been, but from embracing who she was becoming. And as they walked through life together, hand in hand, Sarah and Tom realized that their love had deepened in ways they had never imagined. The trials they had faced had reshaped them, and together, they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. They had found peace in the journey, and that, in the end, was more than enough.